Hi there, welcome back to the Python Mastery Crash Course. I'm Goreti Golden. So this is a continuation of the lists, tuples, sets, and dictionaries. And in this video, we are going to mainly focus on the tuples. So let's get started. Tuples are a collection of values that can be of any data type, including strings, integers, floats, and even other tuples. So they are quite similar to lists, but unlike the lists, tuples are immutable, meaning that their content cannot be modified after creation. Now let's look at how to create a tuple. You can create a tuple by enclosing sequence of values in parentheses. For example, let's say that we have a tuple that is storing max. So first of all, you go ahead and define the variable max, and then you assign it. So following the syntax, you always have to add the parentheses in order to create a tuple, and the items will always be stored within these parentheses. For example, if we want to store a max, we can go ahead and say 70, 80, 78, and maybe a 67 or a 68. And having created our tuple, we can go ahead and have it printed. So this is going to be max. So when I run the program, you can see that the items in the tuple are outputted, and same applies to the parentheses. So just like you saw in the lists, we can also confirm the type of this variable max by working with the type function. So you can go ahead and access the type function, and then we pass in the variable, which is max. So still having created it, we can go ahead and test our program. So you can see that the variable max is of type tuple. So we can also create a tuple using the tuple function in Python, which is a built-in function. So regarding the tuple function, you can always pass an iterable like a list, a string, or a dictionary as an argument. For example, let's say that we are going to have a list of edges. So this is a list that is going to store different edge types. So for example, one is edged 23, then 22, 21, and lastly 24. So for you to be able to create a tuple, one, you have to go ahead and define a new variable that is going to store the tuple. For example, let's say that the variable is going to be edges tuple, such that we assign it to 1. We make use of the tuple constructor function. So you type tuple, then you pass in the parentheses so that you access the function. And this function always takes in iterables as the arguments. So in this one, you want to go ahead and pass in the edges list. And having we passed it in, we can now go ahead and print the edges tuple. And let's test out the output. So you can see that the edges tuple is having 23, 22, 21, and 24. So this tuple has been created using the tuple constructor function. And then the other iterable can be using a string. So regarding a string, that means that we have to go ahead and create a variable that is going to store a string. For example, let's say that the variable is name, such that the name is golden. And then having declared that variable name, we can now go ahead and create a new variable called name tuple, such that we assign it to the tuple function, and within the tuple function we pass in our newly created iterable, which is the name string. And having defined this as well, we can now go ahead and print our name tuple. So regarding a string, we are going to have the items in this name. The name is golden, so all the characters or the letters in this name are going to be splintered into strings in a way that the tuple is going to be a tuple that is storing strings of the letters in this name golden. So let's have this confirmed. So now you can see that the output is this. So each letter in the string has been splintered into an independent string character, thus creating a total sum of the items fully stored in the tuple. And thus this is a tuple of strings. So with tuples, we can also have them created from strings. For example, let's say that we do have a variable called location that is storing a value of Kampala. So by default, we know that the type of this variable is a string. And for us to be able to confirm this, we can go ahead and access the type function, and then we pass in the location such that we have this confirmed very fast. So you can see that the location is of type string, but now there are cases whereby, for example, you can say that you accidentally added a comma to this value. So whenever you add a comma, this makes the location variable of type tuple, and we can also have this confirmed. So you see that now the type is changing from a string to a tuple. So that means that whenever you go ahead and add a comma, it automatically makes the variable a tuple. Now that we have tuples, let's see how to access their elements. You can access tuple elements using indexing, just like you saw with the lists. For example, let's say that we are going to make use of the edges tuple in a way that we want to access the first edge. So regarding positive indexing, we are going to go ahead and print the output of the first item in the edge tuple. So the first thing that you always have to do is to access the variable, which is edges tuple. And just a reminder that with indexing, you always have to access the square brackets, and then you pass in the exact index for the item for which you want to access. So in this one, you want to access the first item, and just like lists and tuples, they are always array-like structured, meaning that the first item is always at an index of 0. This is going to go ahead and print the first item. And now regarding the negative indexing, we can go ahead and also print the value by accessing the edges tuple. And then with the negative indexing, we can go ahead and access the last item in the tuple. So negative indexing, we always start from the right. So this is going to be a -1 for the last item. So you can see that the first item is 23, and then the last item is 24. So let's look at slicing in tuples. So tuple slicing is similar to list slicing. You can always use the same syntax to slice tuples, just like we did in the lists. So for example, we are going to go ahead and access the first 2 items from our edges tuple, and we are going to make use of the print function. And now for us to be able to access the first 2 edges, one, you go ahead and access the edges tuple. And for us to be able to slice, you always have to access the square brackets as well. And since we want to keep track of only the first 2 items, and that is 23 and 22, that means that 1, we want to access the first item, which is at index 0, and then the last item, which is 22, is at index 1. And in terms of slicing, the last item for which you want to access must be incremented with a +1. So since 22 is at index 1, that means that this is going to be incremented to 2. And having done that, we can now go ahead and test the program. So you can see that we are having 23 and 22. So in addition, we can also try to print all the items in our tuple. So we are going to access our edges tuple, and then we open up the square brackets. Now for us to be able to access all the items, that means that we can just pass in the slice operator only, such that it makes the first and the last items all, actually it makes all the items inclusive for cases whereby we are not passing in the start of the slice and then the end of the slice. So let's have this confirmed as well. Yeah, so you can see that we are having 23 22, 21, and 24. So you can do more practice regarding the slicing of the tuples. Well, so now let's look at methods in tuples. Tuples have a few methods that you can use. For example, let's look at the index method. Now, regarding the index method, it returns the index of the first occurrence of the specified value. So, for example, we know that the value 23 is at index 0. So, for us to confirm this, we can make use of the index function. And in terms of the index function, 1, you always have to access the variable. So the variable in this case is the edges tuple and the tuples. So for us to be able to access the built-in methods, you always access the dot or the full stop, or sometimes it's also called the period operator. Then you can see the methods that are attached on the tuple. So we do have the index, so you access the index and then you pass in the parentheses. And in this one, you want to go ahead and return the index of 23. So you pass in 23, and you should know that at this point of time, the edge 23 is at index 0. So the output that is expected must be 0. So let's have this tested as well. So you can see that the output is 0, which is true. So it's similar to when you pass in 22. That means that the index is going to be 1, and same applies to all these other items. So can try to pass in 22. So the index of 23 is 0, and then that of 22 is 1, which is true for this case. Well, so now let's look at the count function. The count function simply returns the number of occurrences of the specified value. So for us to see how this function works, you go ahead and access the print function, and then you access our edges tuple, then you access the period operator, and now we want to make use of the count function. So it returns the number of occurrences of a value, and the value returned is of type int by default. So we can test this out with any number. So we can pass in 24, and since 24 is only appearing once, then that means that the occurrence output or its count is going to equate to 1. So you can see that this is true, and it is the same case for all these other values. Well, so now let's look at the tuple operations. Tuples support a few operations like concatenation and repetition. For example, let's say that we want to concatenate, or we want to add in more items in our max tuple. So one, for us to work with concatenation, we are going to access our print function, and then for us to concatenate the max with some other max, you access the max variable. And in terms of concatenation, we always work with the addition operator. So we do a plus, and for us to be able to add in or to concatenate it with more max, you first of all open the parentheses and you go ahead and create a new tuple with a max. And in terms of this, we can pass in some max like 89, 90, and 92. So having concatenated our max with this new max, we can go ahead and test this out. So you can see that the insertion has been done, and it always occurs at the extreme end. So we do have our items 89, 90, and 92. So we can also try out the repetition on tuples. For example, if we wanted to go ahead and repeat our current edges twice, we can do this by accessing the print function, and then we pass in the edges tuple. And since we want to have the edges repeated twice for each item in the tuple, so you can access the multiplication operator and then the number of repetition, which is going to be 2. Then you can go ahead and test this out. So you can see that initially we had edges ranging from, actually edges like 23, 22, 21, and lastly 24. But when we perform a repetition operation, you can see that we are having the items repeated. So that means that these items are repeated twice. So we just have a duplication of the current items that were initially existing within our tuple. Lastly, let's look at tuple unpacking. So tuple unpacking is a powerful feature in Python that allows you to assign values from a tuple to multiple variables. So for example, let's say that we wanted to unpack some items from our tuple that is the max tuple, which is this one. So let's say that we wanted to unpack items like 70 or max like 70 and 80. So with unpacking, the first thing that you have to do is one, defining the values for which we are going to assign the items from the tuple. For example, we can define variables like, let's say A and B. And since we are unpacking, you always have to ensure that these variables are defined in one line. And having defined them, you always work with the comma separator to distinguish them. And having done that, you can always access the equal sign. Then we assign these to our max tuple. And what you have to know with unpacking, first of all, let's say that you're trying to print out the value of A. So you can see that in terms of unpacking, it's when you try to print out one of the value whereby you haven't fully unpacked all the other elements, you get a value error. So it means that in terms of unpacking, we also have to ensure that these other values are unpacked. So we pass in 4 variables to fully cater for the items in the tuple. Remember that the items in the tuple are 4. So that means that the unpacking is supposed to be done 4 times. So having done that, we can now retest and see whether the error has been cleared up. So you can see that we have unpacked 70 and the value 70 has been stored in the variable A. Now we can also test out for the value D, and you can see that D is 68, meaning that all the marks have been unpacked or extracted from our tuple and each assigned to its variable as defined above. And that's it for today's video on tuples in Python. I hope you learned something new and useful. Thanks for watching, and see you again in the next video.